Hi, I'm Dr. Russell Conjute. Let's now consider the philosophical influences of rationalism and empiricism on some of the early aspects of the development of what would eventually become the discipline of psychology. Philosopher George Santayana once stated, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." I guess the reason for going back into history and trying to understand some of the historical aspects that led to the discipline of psychology has a lot of advantages in terms of your appreciation of the discipline. Number one, it gives you a broader and greater perspective and a deeper understanding of how the current disciplines have come to be. And through looking at history, you can see that changes within psychology aren't linear, and what happens is investigators are human, and there are trends or fads or fashions within psychology, or within any science for that matter, where a discovery or a theoretical position becomes popular amongst scientists, and there's surge in research and theoretical development in a particular area. Also, looking at history helps us avoid the repetition of mistakes. If we can recognise how we've done things in the past, we can avoid making similar types of mistakes in the future. And quite contrary to that is there has been often in history very insightful ideas and propositions put forward in history, but sometimes they can't be actualised for either it may be technological limitations at the time, or it might be because that particular idea wasn't popular at the time, so it wasn't developed further. And sometimes modern perspectives or modern theoretical ideas draw from ideas that were developed previously in history and weren't fully appreciated until the availability or openness of theoretical concepts in the future, or the available technology in the future, allows it to become actualized. So for this series, I want to cover some of the precursors of what could be considered the birth of psychology as a discipline. In this first instance, we're going to talk about the philosophical influences that first had a bearing on the development of psychological principles, and then in some further series we're going to talk about the influences of medicine and the influences of physiology on what would eventually become the discipline of psychology. Many people cite the birth of psychology as being the development of the first psychology lab at the University of Leipzig in 1879 by Wilhelm Wundt, and that was considered by most individuals as when psychology first began as a discipline. But the influences of philosophy and medicine and physiology accumulated in this focused attempt to uncover the basic principles of psychology in Wundt's lab. And at the same time, in parallel, William James at Harvard started to work on his approach to psychology as well, and we'll explore William Wundt's and William James's approaches later on in the series. But for the moment, what we want to do is we want to concentrate on what were those early philosophical influences which have led to this accumulation of the beginnings of psychology as a discipline. So why philosophy? Well, many would argue that psychology grew out of philosophy, and some of the key issues that have been existing within philosophy for ages are still exist within modern psychology today, and have persisted throughout psychology as some key fundamental questions regarding the human condition and human behaviour. Some of these persistent questions that have risen out of philosophy which persist in psychology are such as the mind-body problem. And the mind-body problem is essentially the idea of how separate is the concept of the human mind from the brain. is the mind something separate from the brain, or is it one and the same thing? And with modern approaches in terms of neuroimaging, this is becoming a more and more prominent question. But it arose from early philosophical ideas of how separate the mind is from the body. The other thing is the origins of human knowledge. And that is the idea of how do we understand the world around us? Can we basically trust our senses? Or is it only our thought that we can really reliably believe is true? And that's where I'm going to explore some fundamental philosophical arguments in this particular series here. And that is the idea that when we're trying to seek ultimate truth within a scientific framework, what can we definitely know is true and real? And philosophy has struggled with this throughout the ages, and it still has relevance to psychology today. Also, the age-old nature versus nurture debate. So, is it the fundamental biological inheritance which is principal in human behaviour, or is it the environment? And many would argue it's a combination of both, but there's always that persistent theme, especially with the rise of genetics and genetic recognition of the role of genetics and inheritance in behavioural and psychological disorders, and also the important influence of environmental upbringing and in early development, the fetal development of young infants. So that is a philosophical argument. Well, it started as a philosophical argument, but it has persisted in psychology today. There's also the relationship between humans and non-human animals, and that is the idea of, do we consider ourselves to be just another animal, or are we something unique and special that separates us from the rest of the animal kingdom? And the development of Charles Darwin's notions of natural selection and evolution had a huge impact on these types of concepts. And up until the concepts of evolution, most held the position that humans were qualitatively different from animals and other non-human creatures. But with the concept of evolution, the idea that we are mainly different from other animals in terms of some type of quantitative sense, but not necessarily a qualitative sense, led to the notion that we could use animals as models for human behaviour. And this opened up to the door for a whole new range of inquiry into behaviour, not just in understanding animal behaviour, but findings in animals which then would be applicable to humans. Now, that type of perspective quickly came into opposition, and it was mainly from what we would call empiricism or British empiricism. And this was from researchers such as John Locke, who basically argued that that sensory information is all we have to go by. So if we're going to understand the world, we really just have to use that sensory information and make the best we can to try to understand the world around us. And through systematically looking at what's around us and systematically working through sensory information, we will build knowledge. And he basically argued that as human beings, as we construct our understanding of the world, we work from essentially a blank slate or a tabula rasa. And all that we build, all our knowledge that we build, is basically from a simple relationship between sensory experience and reflection upon that sensory experience. And simple knowledge about sensory processes can build upon itself to form complex knowledge. And that was the fundamental basis of all our knowledge, is what John Locke would argue. Another researcher, David Hume, basically took that a little bit further. He argued that our understanding of the world was fundamentally tied into our observations, and that we assumed a lot about functionality and causation by our experiences of contiguity and basically timed coincidence, laws of resemblance, laws of contiguity, laws of cause and effect were basically derived from our observations over time. From our experience in life, we would observe that when one ball hit another ball, it would cause the other ball to move. But that assumption of causation was simply drawn from our experiences of seeing one ball hit another ball over time, and we would then assume that what we have seen in the past would repeat itself in the future. And probably one of his most controversial theories was what was called bundle theory. And his argument was essentially that our world is made up of sensory information. And what we do with that sensory information is try to make sense of it. So if we hold up an apple, for instance, there's the smell of an apple, the feel of an apple, the taste of an apple, and the visual qualities of an apple. So there's all this sensory information of what makes up an apple. But what Hume argued is that the apple itself doesn't exist. It's a bunch of sensory information that we put together to make sense of our world, and we call an apple. But the actual existence of the apple isn't there. It's just sensory information that we try to organize into something that makes sense for us. And he, in a sense, is almost the opposite of Descartes, in that he argues that the only thing that is real is sensory information, and that we put it together to try to make sense of it. And the labels that we give aren't real themselves. So he would say that the notion that I think, therefore I am, suggests that, well, experiencing thought and that self-perception is just sensory information, and therefore it doesn't necessarily prove that you exist. See, he was very much a perspective that was quite contrary to Descartes. So basically, there was two very polarized types of approaches to how we understand the world from early philosophy. So we had rationalists such as Descartes, which basically contended that the way knowledge is gained is only through reason and thought, and the mind actively transforms sensory information, but essentially only true knowledge can be gained through reasoning. Whereas empiricists, on the other hand, like Locke, would argue that all knowledge is gained through experience, and that only through observation and systematic investigation of sensory information can we build knowledge through laws such as the laws of association. Now, despite these very polar views, you could contend that these different approaches actually complement each other and are a fundamental part of what psychology is today. So if you consider both the rationalist and empirical approaches, they both kind of have their place in psychology, in that the work favoured by empiricists is very empirical, quantitative types of work. So by definition, imperial project is one that requires observation and quantification of that observation, and that makes up basically scientific observation, standardized observation types of approaches, whereas a rationalist is more about theoretical ideas, the idea of proposing a relationship between things, or a theoretical thought experiment along the lines of how we understand the world. But they can complement each other. So you can have a rationalist approach where you put together a theoretical idea, and then an empiricist aspect of that where you empirically test that idea through systematic observation. So really, although these were quite polar types of approaches in philosophy, they're both quite fundamental aspects of the scientist practitioner type of model that we use in psychology today, in that what we want to do is we want to formulate theoretical ideas and test them empirically, and then interpret them in terms of these theoretical concepts. So it's almost like an intertwining of empiricism and rationalism to form basically our approach to psychology.